She was 19 and had just been thrown out. No warning, just an older sister who had sold the house. And with $10 and her grandmother's drawknife in the back of a borrowed truck, she bought an old cooper's shed on a limestone creek in the bluegrass of central Kentucky, in a stretch of Mercer County that had not seen a working barrel since 1964. The oak walls had gone silver. The foundation was buried in vine. But what nobody knew was that hidden inside the last barrel in that old shed was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now Harker had grown up with the smell of charred oak. Not the smell of a campfire or wood-burning stove. The deeper, sweeter, more specific smell of white oak that has been split along the grain and shaped into staves and bent over a fire, and then charred on the inside with a controlled flame, until the surface of the wood turns black and the sugars in the oak caramelize into a thin layer of carbon and sweetness that will, over the next 4 or 8 or 12 years, give color and flavor to whatever liquid is stored inside the barrel. Her grandmother had taught her to recognize that smell the way certain grandmothers in certain Kentucky counties teach a child the one thing that matters most, by putting her beside the fire and letting her breathe it in until the breathing became knowing. Her grandmother's name was Opal Harker, and she had been a barrel chera at the Jessamine Creek Cooperage in Harrodsburg, Kentucky for 32 years. Opal had not been a cooper. She had not built the barrels. Opal had been a chera, the person who controlled the fire inside the barrel after the cooper had assembled it. The person who determined how deeply the oak was burned and how much sweetness the barrel would give to the bourbon that would age inside it. The distinction mattered. A cooper built the vessel. A chera gave the vessel its voice. Opal had been born in 1936 in a small frame house on a back road outside Harrodsburg, the daughter of a tobacco farmer named Virgil Harker, who had raised barley on 80 acres of limestone soil, and who had, like most tobacco farmers in Mercer County, also kept a small bourbon operation, a copper pot still in the barn, a rick house behind the tobacco shed, and a standing arrangement with the Jessamine Creek Cooperage to buy barrels at cost in exchange for Virgil letting the cooperage cut white oak from the timber stand on the back 40. The relationship between the farm and the cooperage had been the kind of arrangement that sustained rural Kentucky for 200 years. The farmer provided the wood, the cooper provided the barrel, the bourbon provided the income, and the limestone water that ran beneath all of it provided the mineral character that made bourbon taste different from whiskey made anywhere else. Opal had gone to work at the cooperage at 16 in 1952, hired by the owner, a man named Augustus Freewitt, known to everyone as Gus, to sweep the shed floor and stack staves. Gus had run the cooperage from 1930 until his death in 1964, making barrels by hand for the bourbon distilleries and small farm operations of Mercer and the surrounding counties. He had been the last hand cooper in the county, the last man who split his own staves from white oak logs, shaped them with a draw knife, assembled them over a fire, and charred the interiors himself, controlling the char level by eye and by smell rather than by timer or thermometer. Gus had noticed, within Opal's first month, that the girl had an unusual sensitivity to the fire. She could tell, by the smell of the smoke rising from inside a barrel during the charring process, exactly how deep the char had penetrated. Whether it was a light char, which would give the bourbon a vanilla note, or a medium char, which would give it caramel, or a heavy char, which would give it the deep smoky sweetness that distillers called alligator, because the surface of the wood cracked into a pattern that looked like alligator skin. Most cheras needed to pull the barrel off the fire and look inside. Opal could tell by the smoke. "You have the nose," Gus told her on her third week. "I've been doing this for 22 years and I've only met one other person who could read the char by smell. That was my father. He built this cooperage." Gus had trained Opal across the next 4 years, teaching her to control the char fire, a small controlled burn set inside the assembled barrel, fed with wood shavings, managed by the angle of the barrel and the flow of air through the bung hole. The fire burned for between 30 seconds and 5 minutes, depending on the char level the distiller had ordered, and the chera's job was to know, by smell and by the color of the smoke, exactly when to douse the fire with water. Too early and the char was too light. Too late and the staves would burn through. The window was narrow. Opal had also learned from Gus about the wood itself. Gus had taught her to read the grain of a white oak stave by looking at it and understanding what it was. A stave with tight, straight grain would char evenly and give a clean flavor. A stave with wavy or interlocked grain would char unevenly and give a muddled flavor. A stave with a knot would burn through at the knot and ruin the barrel. Gus had selected his staves by hand, one at a time, from the split oak bolts in the yard, and he had rejected more staves than he kept because a barrel made from the wrong wood was a barrel that would ruin the bourbon. Gus had died in 1964 when Opal was 28. The cooperage had closed. Gus's sons had not wanted the business, and the bourbon industry had shifted to machine-made barrels from large cooperages in Louisville. Opal had taken a job at the Mercer County feed mill, sacking grain for $1.85 an hour because the cooperage had been the only employer in the county that needed a chera, and the feed mill was the only employer that was hiring. She had worked at the feed mill for 20 years, from 1964 until 1984 when her back had given out. She had never charred another barrel. But Opal had kept the knowledge. She had kept it the way mountain people keep knowledge, not in a book and not in a file, but in her body, in her hands, in the specific memory of how white oak smells at each stage of the charring process. She had kept Gus's draw knife in the closet of her bedroom for 40 years. She had kept a single charred stave from the last barrel Gus had made leaning against the wall in the kitchen. And she had sometimes, on winter evenings, held the stave to the light and run her fingers along the grain and the char, and told Nell about the cooperage. Opal had told Nell about the day Gus had charred a barrel for a distiller in Frankfurt who had ordered an alligator char, the deepest, longest burn. And Gus had held the fire for 5 full minutes, reading the smoke the entire time, his face a foot from the bung hole. And when he had doused the fire and pulled the barrel off and tipped it to show the interior, the char pattern had been perfect. Every stave cracked in the same deep alligator pattern, the carbon layer even from top to bottom, the smell rising from inside the barrel, a complex sweetness that Opal said was the closest thing to bourbon that was not bourbon. The distiller had looked inside the barrel and said, "That's the best char I've ever seen." Gus had said, "That's because I didn't look. I listened." He had meant the sound of the fire, the specific crackling that changed pitch as the char deepened. But he had also meant the smell because for Gus, listening and smelling and seeing had all been the same sense, the sense of attention. And attention was the only tool a chera really needed. Opal had also told Nell about the day a barrel had burned through. It had happened once in 32 years. A stave with a hidden knot, invisible on the surface, and the fire had found the knot and burned through it in 10 seconds, and the flame had shot out the side of the barrel like a torch. And Opal had doused the fire and pulled the barrel off and looked at the hole and said to Gus, "I should have caught that." And Gus had said, "Nobody catches a buried knot. Not me, not you, not God. You learn it and you move on." Opal had told Nell this story not as a confession, but as a lesson. The trade included failure, and the failure was part of the knowledge. And a chera who had never burned through a barrel was a chera who had not done enough barrels. Opal had married a man named Buford Harker, a cousin, a quiet man who had worked at the limestone quarry outside Harrodsburg for 26 years, and who had understood that a wife who kept a charred stave in the kitchen and a draw knife in the closet was a wife whose real life had happened somewhere else, and who was not going to stop remembering it. Buford had died in 2001. Opal had continued alone. Opal and Buford had had 2 daughters, Nell's mother, a woman named Jeline, and Nell's aunt, a woman named Donna. Jeline had married a man named Ray, who had driven a truck for a feed company, and who had died in a highway accident when Nell was 7. Jeline had died of cancer 3 years later when Nell was 10. Nell had been raised from the age of 10 by Donna, Opal's older daughter, who had lived in a small house in Harrodsburg, and who had worked at the county courthouse as a records clerk, and who had taken Nell in because Donna was the kind of woman who did what needed to be done without discussing it. Nell had spent every weekend at Opal's house from the time she was 6, before her mother died and after. The weekends at Opal's had been the fixed point, the way a fixed point works in a life that has no other fixed points. Opal's kitchen had smelled of charred oak and coffee, and the specific mineral smell of limestone water from the well. And the charred stave had leaned against the wood beside the wood stove, and the draw knife had been in the closet. And these 3 things, the smell, the stave, the knife, had been the furniture of Nell's childhood. Opal had taught Nell to read wood grain at 6. She had picked up a piece of firewood from the wood box beside the stove and held it in front of Nell and said, "What do you see?" "Wood," Nell said. "Look at the lines," Opal said. "The lines are the years. Each line is 1 year of the tree's life. Tight lines mean the tree grew slow. Wide lines mean it grew fast. Slow wood is strong wood. Fast wood is weak wood. A cooper wants slow wood. A barrel made from slow wood will hold bourbon for 20 years. A barrel made from fast wood will leak in 5. Nell had looked at the firewood. She had seen the lines. She had not, at 6, understood why they mattered. She understood now. By 8, Nell could pick up a piece of white oak and tell Opal whether it was quarter sawn or flat sawn, 2 different ways of cutting a log that produced 2 different grain patterns, one tight and one open, one suitable for barrels and one not. By 10, Opal had let Nell hold the drawknife. The drawknife was heavy, a wide curved blade between 2 wooden handles designed to be pulled toward the body with both hands, shaving thin curls of wood from the surface of a stave clamped in a shaving horse. Opal had not owned a shaving horse, so she had taught Nell to use the drawknife on the kitchen table, clamping a piece of scrap oak in the table vise Buford had bolted to the end, and drawing the blade toward her in long, smooth strokes. "Let the blade do the work," Opal said. "You're not pushing, you're guiding. The blade knows how much wood to take. Your job is to keep it straight." By 12, Nell could shave a stave to even thickness using Opal's drawknife, a skill that had taken Gus's apprentices 2 years to learn, and that Nell had learned in 6 months of weekend visits because Nell had the same thing Opal had, the hands, the steady, patient, unhurried hands of a person who understands that wood cannot be rushed. By 14, Nell had begun to understand the charring. She could not char. Opal had no barrel to char, and the drawknife was a shaping tool, not a fire tool. But she could smell. Opal had taught her to smell the charred stave the way Gus had taught Opal to smell the smoke, by holding it close and breathing slowly and noticing the layers, the surface carbon first, sharp and clean, then the caramelized sugar beneath, sweet and warm, then the raw oak below, that woody and tannic. 3 layers in one piece of wood, each layer telling a different part of the story. Nell had memorized the layers by 14. She could pick up the charred stave from the kitchen wall and hold it to her nose and tell Opal which layer she was smelling, and Opal had said, "You have the nose, too. Your grandfather Virgil could smell rain coming from 20 miles. It's the same nose. It just found a different use." Opal had died when Nell was 16, a stroke at home on a winter morning in February. She had been sitting in the kitchen beside the wood stove with the charred stave in her lap, the way she sat every morning, holding the stave and looking at the grain in the gray winter light. Nell had been there. Donna had driven her out for a Saturday visit. Nell had walked into the kitchen and found Opal in the chair with the stave across her knees and the drawknife on the table beside her, and the wood stove ticking, and the coffee still warm on the counter. Nell had taken the drawknife, the charred stave, and a photograph of Opal standing at the cooperage fire in 1960, her face lit by the glow from inside a barrel. Donna had not wanted any of these things. After Opal's death, Nell had finished high school in Harrodsburg and had not gone to college. She had gotten a job working for a farrier, a horse shoer named Clyde Mattingly, who traveled the horse farms of Mercer County in a truck fitted with a portable forge, shoeing thoroughbreds and farm horses. Nell had been Clyde's assistant, holding horses, maintaining the forge, cleaning the tools, at $12 an hour. And the work had suited her because the work involved fire and iron, and the same steady patience that coopering required. She had lived with Donna for 3 years after Opal's death. Arrangement had ended in the spring of Nell's 19th year when Donna had married a man named Phil from Lexington, and Phil had decided to sell Donna's house in Harrodsburg and move them both to a subdivision in Nesholasville. Donna had apologized. "Phil wants a fresh start." Donna said, "He doesn't want the old house." "I'm sorry, Nell." The house had been sold. Nell had not been on the deed. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever held a piece of wood and known by the lines in the grain how strong it was? She had $10 in her pocket and Opal's drawknife in the back of Clyde's truck. She had the charred stave wrapped in a horse blanket. Clyde told her about the building. They were shoeing a horse at a farm outside Shakertown on a Monday morning when Clyde set down a hoof and said, "There's an old cooper's shed on Shawnee Run Creek about 4 miles south of Harrodsburg. County's had it on the surplus list since 2010. $10. Nell said, "A cooper's shed," Clyde said, "Gus Prewitt's place. Your grandmother worked there." He looked at her. "I'm telling you because Opal would have wanted you to know. And because you were sleeping in my truck, and that's not a long-term plan. She walked to the Mercer County clerk's office in Harrodsburg that afternoon. The clerk, a woman named Mrs. Sizemore, stamped the deed and handed Nell an iron key on a loop of hemp cord. Gus Prewitt's key, Mrs. Sizemore said. His grandson brought it to this office in 2009 and said, "If anybody asks for it, give it to them." Nobody asked. She looked at Nell. Until now. She drove Clyde's truck down Shawnee Run Road that evening. The shed stood on the creek bank exactly as Opal had described it, a long, low oak plank building with a stone foundation, a wide door on iron hinges, and a stone chimney at the far end where the charring fire had been. She put the key in the lock. It turned. One room. Oak plank walls silvered with age, a packed earth floor, heavy timber beams, a stone hearth built into the north wall with a wide flue above. Along the east wall, a shaving horse, a low wooden bench with a foot-operated clamp for holding staves. Along the west wall, wooden racks that had held finished barrels. Most of the racks were empty, but on the lowest rack at the far end of the shed, one barrel remained. The barrel was smaller than the bourbon barrels Nell had seen at the distilleries, about 20 gallons, the size of a small whiskey barrel, white oak. The staves tight-jointed and smooth. The barrel was sealed. The head fitted into the crow's groove and held in place by the hoop pressure. The bung hole plugged with a fitted oak bung. Nobody had opened this barrel since it had been sealed. Nell lifted the barrel from the rack and set it on the packed earth floor. She worked the bung loose with Opal's drawknife handle. She tapped the top hoop upward and pried the head free. Inside the barrel, packed tight against the charred interior, were leather tool roll, a heavy canvas pouch, and a thick leather-bound book. The charred wood had kept them dry. The barrel had been a vault. The tool roll held a matched set of Cooper's hand tools, a drawknife with a forged blade and ash handles, a crow's for cutting the groove that holds the barrel head, a howl for smoothing the inside of the staves, a bung borer for drilling bung holes, a jointer plane for truing the edges of the staves, and a heading float for smoothing the barrel heads. Each tool handle was stamped AP Augustus Prewitt. The drawknife was the twin of Opal's drawknife. The canvas pouch held gold coins, 37 Liberty Quarter Eagles dated between 1930 and 1963. The coin dealer in Lexington valued them at approximately $23,000. The book was a stave book, page after page of hand-drawn diagrams showing how to select wood grain for different barrel types, how to split a bolt along the medullary rays for maximum strength, and how to char at 4 different levels. Each level annotated with Gus's handwritten notes on what flavor the char would produce. Level 1, 15 seconds, light toast, vanilla. Level 2, 30 seconds, medium toast, caramel and toffee. Level 3, 60 seconds, heavy char, smoke, and dark sugar. Level 4, 5 minutes, alligator char, deep molasses, and burnt honey. Each level illustrated with a drawing of the wood's surface at that stage of charring, the cracks and patterns rendered in careful pencil detail. Tucked inside the front cover was a folded letter. To whoever opens this barrel. My name is Augustus Prewitt. I have made barrels in this shed from 1930 until today, the 8th of October, 1964. I am 70 years old and I'm closing the cooperage because the machine barrels from Louisville have made my work unnecessary. I am sealing my tools and my savings and my stave book inside this barrel because a barrel is the driest, tightest, most airtight vessel a man can build. If the barrel holds, the tools will keep. I do not know who will open this barrel. I hope it is a person who understands that a barrel is not a container. A barrel is a partnership between the wood and whatever is stored inside it. The wood gives, the liquid takes, and over time they become the same thing. Augustus Prewitt, Cooper, October 8, 1964. Nell read the letter twice, then she placed both palms flat against the inside of the barrel, the charred surface black and crackled, the alligator pattern Gus had described in his stave book, and pressed. The char was rough and warm under her hands, and she could feel, beneath the char, the grain of the oak, the tight, slow rings of a tree that had grown on limestone. Knee soil for 100 years before Gus had split it into staves and bent it into a circle. She did not cry, and she did not speak. She pressed her palms into the char and held them there and breathed in the smell of charred oak that had been sealed inside this barrel for 60 years, and that smelled exactly like Opal's kitchen. She said quietly to the barrel in the shed in the stone chimney, "Thank you, Mr. Prewitt. I can smell it." The next morning, she drove Clyde's truck to Lexington and deposited the coin dealer's check at the bank on Main Street. She opened a checking account and drove back. The following week, she bought her own truck, a 2000 Chevy S10 with 183,000 miles and a dented fender, from a retired farmer in Bergen for $1,700. The first month was the chimney and the floor. The stone hearth where the charring fire had burned was choked with fallen mortar and 60 years of leaf litter blown in through cracks in the chimney cap. Nell cleared the hearth by hand, scooping the debris into a feed sack and carrying each sack to the creek bank. Clyde drove out on a Saturday morning in his farrier's truck with a bag of mortar mix and helped her repoint the chimney cap and the hearthstones. Gus Prewitt built this hearth to hold a charring fire, Clyde said, troweling mortar between the stones. A charring fire runs at about 700 degrees for 5 minutes. These stones have handled 1,000 charring fires. They'll handle 1,000 more. He looked at the shed and said, "Your grandmother stood at this hearth, right where you are standing. She told me once, I was shoeing a horse at the Prewitt farm. She said the charring fire was the most beautiful fire she'd ever seen because it burned inside something it was making. She made the shed livable in pieces." She bought a folding army cot from the thrift store in Harrodsburg for $10 and set it against the south wall near the small window that looked out at the creek. She found a potbelly wood stove at an estate sale in Salvasa for $25, squat, cast iron, heavy, and Clyde helped her wrestle it through the wide door and set it on a flat limestone slab she had pulled from the creek bed. She ran the stovepipe through a hole she chiseled in the plank wall, packing the gap with creek clay. A woman named Mrs. Vanover, who owned the farm across the creek, heard from Mrs. Sizemore that the girl had bought the Prewitt shed and walked over one evening with a cardboard box, a coffee pot, 2 tin cups, a skillet, a sack of cornmeal, a jar of sorghum molasses, and a pound of bacon. "Your grandmother charred the barrel my husband ages his bourbon in," Mrs. Vanover said. "That barrel is 31 years old and it's still giving flavor. I figure I owe Opal a meal or two." She came back every Sunday after that with whatever she had: cornbread, soup beans, fried chicken, a jar of pickled beets from her cellar. The first fire she lit in the wood stove, dry hickory splits from a deadfall behind the shed, filled the room with a warmth that traveled across the packed earth floor and up the oak plank walls, and settled into the timber beams. And the old wood in the walls released a faint, sweet smell of oak that mixed with the hickory smoke. And the smell was close, not identical, but close to the smell of Opal's kitchen. And Nell sat on the cot and watched the firelight move across the shaving horse and the barrel racks and the stone hearth and thought, "Gus smelled this. Opal smelled this. The smell is the building remembering what it was built for." She set the charred stave, the one Opal had kept in her kitchen for 40 years, against the wall beside the hearth, exactly where a Chera would lean a stave to inspect it in the firelight. She placed Opal's drawknife and Gus's drawknife side by side on the shaving horse, the two blades facing the same direction. Opal's thinner and darker from 32 years of grain work, Gus's broader and lighter from 60 years sealed in a barrel. She hung the stave book from an iron nail above the shaving horse, open to the alligator char diagram, Gus's most detailed drawing, the cracks and ridges rendered in pencil with the precision of a man who had spent 34 years studying what fire does to wood. She set Opal's photograph on the windowsill above the cot, Opal at the charring fire in 1960, her face lit gold by the glow from inside the barrel. She got a job in her second year, a craft bourbon distillery in Mercer County, one of the small batch operations that were reviving traditional methods, hired her as a cooperage apprentice and barrel chera because the owner, a man named Mr. Bowman, had heard from Clyde that there was a young woman at the old Prewitt shed who owned Gus's original stave book and who could read a char level by smell. Mr. Bowman had driven out to Shawnee Run Creek and had watched Nell light a small test fire inside a barrel she had assembled from staves she had shaved on the shaving horse, and he had watched her douse the fire at exactly the right moment. By smell without looking inside, and he had tapped the barrel and inspected the char and said, "That's a level 3, perfect alligator. Who taught you the nose?" Nell said, "My grandmother." Mr. Bowman said, "Opal Harker charred barrels for Gus Prewitt. If you have her nose, you can start Monday." Word spread through the horse farms and small distilleries of Mercer County. A bourbon maker in Shakertown brought a set of 10 barrels that needed recharring. The original char had faded after 12 years of use, and Nell recharred them in the shed one at a time, controlling the fire the way Opal had controlled it by smell. A woodworker in Danville commissioned a small decorative barrel for a restaurant, and Nell built it from scratch on the shaving horse using Gus's stave book patterns, and the woodworker held it up to the light and said, "The joints are invisible." "Who taught you to fit staves?" Nell said, "Gus's book and my grandmother's knife." On a clear evening in late October of her 22nd year, Nell sat on the stone foundation wall of the shed and watched the last copper light fade across Shawnee Run Creek. The creek ran clear over limestone, the water catching the smoke rose from the chimney, thin and straight, the smoke of a hickory fire in a potbelly stove. Not a charring fire, not yet, but smoke nonetheless, rising from the chimney of Gus Prewitt's cooperage for the first time in 60 years. She thought about Gus, who had built this shed and split his own staves, and charred his own barrels, and sealed his tools inside the last one, because he had understood that a barrel was the tightest vault a man could build. She thought about Opal, who had stood at the charring hearth and read the fire by smell, and who had kept a single charred stave in her kitchen for 40 years, because the stave was the only piece of the cooperage she had been allowed to take. And she thought about Virgil, who had grown white oak on limestone soil, and let the cooper cut it because the farmer and the cooper and the bourbon had all needed the same tree. That's the thing about the fires our grandmothers teach us to read. We do not always know when we are 6 years old, and standing beside a wood stove watching an old woman hold a charred stave up to the light that the watching is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, weekend by weekend, grain by grain. And then, 3 years after the old woman dies, we open the last barrel in a shed she worked in and find the tools of the man who taught her. And we understand what she had been teaching us. She had been teaching us that fire does not destroy wood. Fire transforms it. The char is not a scar. The char is the beginning of what the wood will give. Now, Harker was a 19-year-old and thrown out. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on an old cooper's shed on a limestone creek in the bluegrass country of central Kentucky. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you loved it, we have something special for you. 12 brand new stories never released on YouTube, only available to the people who support this channel directly. Each one a full quiet road story, just like this one. There is also a full audiobook available for the people who want to listen to all 12 in one place. You will find the link in the bio. We poured our whole hearts into these, and we made them for the people who truly listen. Thank you for being one of them. See you on the next quiet road.